The waitress arrived to work at a Millionaire'S luxury wedding. She froze when she saw the photo of her missing mother in a black frame. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of the cramped apartment at 5:30 a.m. But Emily Smith was already awake. She'd been staring at the water stain on the ceiling for the past hour, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up right. $350. That's what she needed for Grandma Helen's next round of medication. And that's exactly what she didn't have. "Morning, sweetheart." Helen's voice drifted from the small bedroom, followed by a bout of coughing that made Emily's chest tighten with worry. "Morning, Grandma. How are you feeling?" Emily called back, already pulling on her black server's uniform. The fabric was worn thin from countless washes, but it was clean and pressed. She made sure of that. "Oh, you know me, tough as old leather," Helen replied with that forced cheerfulness she'd perfected over the past few months. They both knew she wasn't fooling anyone. But it was easier to pretend sometimes. Emily poured 2 cups of coffee from the ancient machine that wheezed and groaned, but somehow still worked, just like everything else in their lives, held together by determination and prayer. She carried 1 cup to Helen, who was sitting up in bed surrounded by pill bottles that seemed to multiply every week. "I've got good news," Emily said, settling on the edge of the bed. "Remember Mrs. Patterson from the diner? She called last night with a special catering gig, some big society wedding on the North Shore." Helen's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful, honey. Those rich folks tip well, don't they? This one's different. It's the Anderson wedding. You know, the real estate family. They're paying triple the usual rate because it's such a big event. If I work all 3 days of prep plus the wedding itself," Emily paused, hardly daring to voice the number, "I could make almost $800. Helen reached out and squeezed Emily's hand with fingers that felt too fragile. "That's more than enough for my medicine, and then some." "Don't worry about the medicine, Grandma. I've got it covered." Emily squeezed back gently. "You just focus on getting better." But as Emily made her way across Chicago on 2 different buses, she couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. $800 would be a miracle. Enough for Helen's medicine, the overdue rent, and maybe even some groceries that weren't on sale. She'd been living on ramen and hope for weeks now, but that was fine. Helen needed real food, real medicine, real care. The North Shore was like stepping into a different world. Emily pressed her face to the bus window, watching as cramped apartments gave way to tree-lined streets, then sprawling lawns, and finally estates that looked like something out of a movie. When she got off at the designated stop, she felt like Dorothy stepping into Oz. Everything was too bright, too clean, too perfect. The Anderson estate sat at the end of a winding driveway that seemed to go on forever. Emily walked slowly, taking in the manicured gardens, the fountain that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years, and the mansion itself, a 3-story monument to wealth that made her feel impossibly small. "You must be Emily," a sharp voice called out. A woman in an expensive suit approached, clipboard in hand, and an expression that suggested smiling was against her religion. "I'm Margaret Walsh, the wedding coordinator. You're late." Emily checked her phone. She was actually 3 minutes early, but she wasn't about to argue. "Sorry, the bus. Follow me. We have a schedule to keep, and Mrs. Anderson doesn't tolerate delays." Margaret's heels clicked against the marble steps, like a metronome keeping time to Emily's growing anxiety. The front doors were massive, solid oak with brass handles that gleamed like gold, but it was what lay beyond them that stopped Emily in her tracks. The foyer was bigger than her entire apartment, with a ceiling that soared up to what must have been the 2nd floor. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on cream-colored walls, and a grand staircase curved upward like something from a fairy tale. "Don't gawk," Margaret snapped. "The other servers are already here. You'll be working the cocktail reception, the dinner service, and cleanup, 3 days of prep, then the wedding on Saturday. Mrs. Anderson expects perfection." Emily nodded, trying to take it all in. Other servers moved through the space like ghosts in black uniforms identical to hers, carrying flowers and linens and all the pieces that would transform this house into a wedding venue worthy of Chicago's social elite. "The groom is Jacob Anderson, the heir to all this," Margaret continued, gesturing vaguely at the opulence surrounding them. "The bride is Ashley Kennedy. Old money meeting new money, if you know what I mean. 300 guests, 5 courses, open bar. It's going to be the wedding of the year. As Margaret rattled off instructions about service protocols and break schedules, Emily found herself studying the portraits lining the walls. Generations of Andersons stared down at her with expressions ranging from stern to smug, all of them radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about rent or medicine, or whether there'd be food on the table tomorrow. "Are you listening?" Margaret's voice cut through Emily's observations. "Yes, ma'am. 5 courses, cocktail hour starts at 6, and we need to stay invisible." "Good. Your supervisor will be James. He'll show you to the service areas and explain the specific requirements for this event. And remember," Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, "the Anderson family values discretion above all else. What you see here, what you hear here, stays here, understood." Emily nodded again, though something about the woman's tone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just about professional discretion. There was something darker underneath, a warning wrapped in velvet. As Margaret led her toward the kitchen, Emily caught glimpses of rooms that seemed to go on forever. A library with books that probably cost more than most people's cars, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, and sitting rooms decorated with art that belonged in museums. But it was the family photos scattered throughout that caught her attention. Formal portraits, candid shots from vacations, images of a life so far removed from her own that it might as well have been fiction. The kitchen was a marvel of stainless steel and marble, buzzing with activity as caterers prepared for the next 3 days. The head chef, a stern-faced woman named Rosa, looked Emily up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of temporary help come and go. "You ever work an event this size?" Rosa asked. "Not exactly, but I'm a fast learner. You'll need to be. The Andersons don't accept mistakes, and neither do I. Keep your head down. Do your job. And maybe you'll make it through the weekend without getting fired." As Emily tied on her apron and began her first day in this glittering world, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much bigger than just a wedding. The way people spoke in hushed tones when they mentioned the Anderson name, the emphasis on discretion, the general atmosphere of walking on eggshells. It all felt like there were secrets hiding behind the crystal and gold. But $800 was $800, and Helen needed her medicine. Emily had learned a long time ago that sometimes you had to step into uncomfortable situations to take care of the people you loved. She just hoped this particular situation wouldn't turn out to be more than she could handle. The second day started like the first. Early morning bus rides, marble floors, and the constant reminder to stay invisible. Emily had gotten through her first day without any major disasters, earning a grudging nod of approval from Rosa, and even a few encouraging words from James, the senior server who'd taken her under his wing. "You're getting the hang of it," James said as they polished glassware in the kitchen. "Just remember, during the actual wedding, we'll be serving some of Chicago's most powerful people, politicians, judges, business leaders, the kind of folks who can make or break careers with a phone call." Emily nodded, carefully placing another crystal glass in the rack. The pay was worth the intimidation factor, and she was already mentally calculating how much she'd have left over after Helen's medicine. Maybe enough for groceries that didn't come from the discount bin. "The family's particular about their privacy too," James continued, lowering his voice. "I've been working events like this for 15 years, and the Andersons, well, let's just say they've got a reputation for being very careful about their image." Before Emily could ask what he meant by that, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Emily, I need you to help set up the memorial display in the main hall. Mrs. Anderson wants it perfect before the rehearsal dinner tonight." Emily followed Margaret through the winding corridors, past more rooms filled with priceless art and furniture that probably had its own insurance policies. The main hall was even more impressive than the foyer. A soaring space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over manicured gardens stretching toward Lake Michigan. "Family photos go here," Margaret said, pointing to an ornate table positioned near the grand staircase. "It's a tradition, displaying pictures of family members who can't be here to celebrate. Mostly deceased relatives, you understand." Boxes of framed photographs sat nearby, and Margaret began arranging them with the precision of a museum curator. "Handle these carefully. Some are quite old and irreplaceable." Emily picked up the first frame, a formal portrait of an elderly man in a military uniform. Then another, a couple from what looked like the 1950s, The woman's dress and hairstyle speaking of post-war optimism. Each photo seemed to tell a story of privilege and prosperity. Generations of Andersons who'd built their fortune brick by brick. This one's particularly important, Margaret said, holding up a larger frame with special care. Elizabeth Bennet. She was married to Robert Anderson's younger brother, Richard. Tragic story, really. Died far too young. Margaret placed the frame in the center of the display, and Emily glanced at it casually as she reached for the next photo. Then her world stopped. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, with dark hair swept back in an elegant style and eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the formal portrait. But it wasn't the woman's beauty that made Emily's hands shake and her heart race. It was her face, a face Emily knew as well as her own, because she'd been looking at it in mirrors for 23 years. The woman in the photograph was her mother. Emily's vision blurred as she stared at the golden plaque beneath the frame. Elizabeth Bennet, beloved wife and mother, 1980-2010. The photo slipped from Margaret's hands as Emily stumbled backward, her mind reeling. This couldn't be right. Her mother's name was Elizabeth Bennet. Yes, but she died in a car accident when Emily was 5 in 2010. Wait, Emily did the math quickly. 2010 would have been 13 years ago, not 18. Are you all right? Margaret's voice sounded far away, as if she were speaking through water. I'm fine, Emily managed, though she was anything but. Just felt dizzy for a second. Margaret studied her with sharp eyes. Perhaps you should get some water. We can't have you fainting during the rehearsal dinner. Emily nodded mutely and backed away from the memorial display, her legs unsteady. She made it to the powder room down the hall before her knees gave out completely. Sitting on the closed toilet seat, she tried to process what she'd just seen. Her mother, Elizabeth Bennet, in a memorial display for the Anderson family, listed as the wife of Richard Anderson, dying in 2010 instead of 2007. Like Grandma Helen had always said, Emily pulled out her phone with shaking hands and stared at the only photo she had of her mother, a faded snapshot Helen had given her years ago. The resemblance was unmistakable, but how was this possible? Helen had told her that Elizabeth was a single mother, that Emily's father was some guy who'd abandoned them both. She'd said Elizabeth died in a car accident when Emily was 5, and that's why Emily had come to live with her grandmother. There had never been any mention of the Anderson family, of Elizabeth being married to someone else. Emily's mind raced through the implications. If her mother had been married to Richard Anderson, what did that make Emily? Was she related to this family somehow? But that didn't make sense either. Make sense. Why would Helen lie about something like that? And why had Emily grown up in poverty? If her mother had been married into one of Chicago's wealthiest families? A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Emily, you okay in there? It was James's voice, concerned and gentle. Just a minute, she called back, splashing cold water on her face and trying to pull herself together. She couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when she needed this job so desperately. When she emerged, James was waiting with a glass of water and a worried expression. Margaret said you looked pale. You sure you're feeling all right? Yeah, it's a lot, being around all this wealth, these important people. I guess I got a little overwhelmed. James nodded sympathetically. I get it. My first high society event. I was so nervous I dropped a whole tray of champagne glasses. But you're doing great, really. Just take it one step at a time. Emily managed a smile, though her mind was still reeling. Thanks. I should get back to work. But as they walked back toward the main hall, Emily couldn't stop herself from stealing another glance at the memorial display. There was her mother's face, smiling serenely from within that golden frame, surrounded by photos of Andersons and their achievements. The plaque gleamed in the afternoon light. Elizabeth Bennet, beloved wife and mother, 1980-2010. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily went through the motions of her job, polishing silver, arranging flowers, helping to set up the elaborate dining room for the rehearsal dinner. But her mind kept returning to that photograph, to the questions multiplying in her head like a virus. During her break, she called Helen. Hi, sweetheart. How's the fancy job going? It's fine, Grandma. Listen, I have a weird question. You said Mom died in a car accident, right? In 2007. There was a pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long. Of course, honey. Why would you ask that? Someone mentioned a woman who died in 2010, and she had the same name, Elizabeth Bennet. Made me think of Mom. Elizabeth's a common name, sweetheart. Don't go borrowing trouble. But Emily could hear something in Helen's voice, a tension that hadn't been there before. Grandma, was there anything else about Mom you never told me? Anything about her family or... Emily Rose Smith, your mother was a good woman who loved you more than life itself. That's all you need to know. Now stop asking questions and focus on that job. We need the money. The line went dead. Leaving Emily staring at her phone, Helen had used her full name, something she only did when Emily was in trouble or when she was trying to end a conversation she didn't want to have. As Emily returned to work, she found herself studying the Anderson family more carefully. Jacob, the groom-to-be, was tall and dark-haired, with an intensity that made him seem older than his 28 years. When he spoke to the staff, his voice was polite but cold, as if he were maintaining careful distance from everyone around him. Robert Anderson, the family patriarch, commanded every room he entered. At 65, he still had the bearing of a man used to getting his way in all things. When he looked at the memorial display, Emily thought she saw something flicker across his face. Not grief, but something harder to define. The rehearsal dinner was an elegant affair, with close family and friends gathering in the formal dining room. Emily served courses and cleared plates, staying invisible as instructed, but all the while she was listening, watching, trying to piece together the mystery of her mother's connection to this family. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Emily found herself alone in the main hall for a moment. She approached the memorial display again, studying her mother's photograph more closely. Elizabeth looked happy in the picture, radiant even, but Emily noticed something else. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was what looked like the corner of this very house. Her mother had been here, in this mansion, as part of this family, and somehow, Emily had ended up working in the same house where her mother had once lived, serving the family that claimed to mourn her. The coincidence was too big to ignore, and Emily was beginning to suspect it wasn't a coincidence at all. Emily barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling, but this time her mind wasn't on medical bills or rent money. It was on her mother's face in that golden frame, on Helen's too quick denial, on the growing certainty that her entire life had been built on lies. By 4 a.m., she gave up on sleep and made coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. The rational part of her mind kept insisting it was all a mistake, some bizarre coincidence. But the larger part, the part that had always felt like something was missing from her life story, knew better. She arrived at the Anderson estate earlier than necessary, hoping the extra time would help her focus on work, instead of the questions burning in her chest. But as she walked through those massive front doors again, seeing the memorial display in the morning light, any hope of distraction evaporated. "You're early," James observed as she tied on her apron in the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be useful. Pre-wedding jitters, huh? I get it. The energy in this place gets pretty intense the day before a big event." If only he knew, Emily thought. The energy she was feeling had nothing to do with wedding preparations. The morning passed in a whirlwind of final preparations. Florists transformed the mansion into a garden paradise. Musicians tested sound systems, and the catering team prepared for what Rosa called the meal of the century. Emily threw herself into the work, polishing silver until she could see her face in it, arranging linens with mathematical precision, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind churned. But she couldn't stop herself from observing the Anderson family with new eyes. During the morning briefing, she watched Robert Anderson address the staff with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of command. When he spoke about family tradition and the importance of discretion, Emily found herself studying his face for any resemblance to her own features. Jacob appeared later, moving through the preparations with an odd detachment that Emily was beginning to recognize as his default state. When Margaret introduced him to the new staff members, his handshake was firm but brief, his smile polite, but never reaching his eyes. Emily wondered what it would be like to grow up in this world of privilege and expectation. Whether wealth made you happier, or just better at hiding your troubles. During her lunch break, Emily stepped outside to call Helen. She'd spent the morning rehearsing what she wanted to say, how to approach the subject without causing her grandmother to shut down again. "Hi, Grandma. How are you feeling today?" "Oh." About the same. These old bones don't like the weather changing. How's work going? It's interesting, Grandma. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about Mom's accident. I know you don't like talking about it, but I realized I don't know much about her life before I was born. Where did she work? Did she have friends here in Chicago? Helen's sigh carried through the phone. Emily, honey, why are you asking these questions now? I'm 23 years old, and I feel like I barely know anything about my own mother. Did she grow up here? How did she meet my father? Your mother was a private person. She didn't talk much about her past, even to me. But she must have said something. Did she have a job? Elizabeth worked as a housekeeper, Helen said suddenly, as if the words had been pulled out of her. For wealthy families, she was good at it. Reliable, trustworthy, that's how she got involved with your father. Emily's heart began to race. A housekeeper. For which families? I don't remember all the details, Emily. It was a long time ago. Grandma, please, this is important to me. Another long pause. When Helen spoke again, her voice was quieter, sadder. She worked for several families over the years. The Kennedys, the Andersons, wealthy people on the North Shore. But Emily, that world, it's not a good world for people like us. Elizabeth learned that the hard way. The phone nearly slipped from Emily's hands. The Andersons. She worked for the Anderson family. Emily, why didn't you ever tell me that? I'm literally working at the Anderson house right now, Grandma. Don't you think that's something I should have known? The silence that followed was so long, Emily thought the call had been disconnected. Grandma, are you there? You're working where? Helen's voice was sharp now, filled with something that sounded like fear. The Anderson estate? It's a catering job for their son's wedding. But Grandma, if Mom worked here, if she was connected to this family somehow. Emily Rose Smith, you listened to me very carefully. Helen's voice had taken on a tone Emily had never heard before. Urgent, almost desperate. You finish that job and you get out of there. Do you understand me? You don't ask questions. You don't go poking around. You just do your work and leave. But why? If Mom worked here, maybe I could learn more about her. Maybe? No. The force of Helen's response made Emily take a step back. Some things are better left buried, Emily. Some families. They're dangerous. Your mother learned that too late. What do you mean dangerous, Grandma? What aren't you telling me? But the line had gone dead. Emily stared at her phone, her mind reeling. Helen had essentially confirmed that Elizabeth had worked for the Anderson family, but her reaction suggested there was much more to the story. And the way she'd said dangerous, there had been real fear in her voice. When Emily returned to work, she found herself studying the Anderson house with new eyes. Her mother had walked these halls, had probably polished the same silver Emily was handling now. But what had happened to her here? And why was Helen so afraid? The afternoon brought more wedding guests arriving for various pre-ceremony events, and Emily found herself serving drinks at a small gathering in the library. The room was impressive, lined floor to ceiling with books that looked like they'd never been opened, punctuated by portraits of Anderson ancestors who stared down with expressions of stern disapproval. As Emily refilled champagne glasses, she couldn't help but overhear conversations between the guests. Most of it was typical society chatter, vacation homes, charity galas, business deals that involved more money than Emily would see in several lifetimes. But occasionally, she caught fragments that made her pay closer attention. Such a shame about Richard, one elderly woman was saying to another. He was always the gentle one, not like Robert. Well, that whole situation with Elizabeth was unfortunate, her companion replied, glancing around to make sure she wasn't overheard. Robert handled it the only way he could, I suppose. Emily nearly dropped the champagne bottle. They were talking about her mother. Still, the poor girl paid a heavy price, the first woman continued. Though I suppose it was better than the alternative. Robert doesn't tolerate scandal, never has. Family reputation comes first. Of course, though I always wondered what really happened to her. The women moved away before Emily could hear more, but their words echoed in her mind. Elizabeth had paid a heavy price. Better than the alternative. What alternative later? As Emily helped clear glasses from the library, she noticed Jacob standing alone near one of the portraits. his expression unreadable. When he saw her approaching, he didn't move away like most of the family members did when staff came near. "Do you ever wonder about the people in these paintings?" he asked quietly. Emily looked up at the portrait he was studying, a stern-faced man in a formal suit from what looked like the early 1900s. "I suppose everyone has a story. Some stories are darker than others." Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. "Some families have secrets that go back generations." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "I imagine most old families have their share of secrets." Jacob turned to look at her directly for the first time since she'd started working there. "The question is whether those secrets should stay buried, or whether someone should dig them up." Before Emily could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Jacob, your father is looking for you, Emily. We need you in the kitchen." As Emily walked away, she could feel Jacob's eyes following her. There had been something in his tone, something that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. But what did he know? And why had he chosen to share those cryptic words with her? The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations, but Emily's mind kept returning to the fragments of conversation she'd overheard, to Helen's fearful warning, to Jacob's mysterious comments about family secrets. By the time she left the estate that evening, she was more convinced than ever that her mother's connection to the Anderson family was deeper and darker than a simple housekeeping job. As the bus carried her back toward home, Emily made a decision. Tomorrow was the wedding, and it would probably be her last day in the Anderson house. If she was going to find answers about her mother, it would have to be then. Helen's warnings echoed in her mind, but the need to know the truth was stronger than fear, whatever secrets the Anderson family was hiding about Elizabeth Bennet. Emily was going to uncover them. Wedding day arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Chicago's lakefront look like a postcard. Emily had barely slept again, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. Today would be her last chance to uncover the truth about her mother's connection to the Anderson family. And she'd spent the night mentally mapping out the mansion's layout, remembering the routine she'd observed over the past 3 days. The estate was buzzing with activity from the moment Emily arrived. Photographers were setting up equipment, musicians were testing sound levels, and an army of staff members moved through the house like worker bees preparing for the event of the year. In all the chaos, Emily realized, it might be easier than ever to slip away unnoticed. Rosa had assigned her to the morning shift, helping with final meal preparations and setting up the reception areas. Emily threw herself into the work, but kept one eye on the clock and another on the movements of the Anderson family. She'd noticed that Robert Anderson had a routine. Every morning around 10 a.m., he retreated to his study for what James had mentioned was his daily cigar and business calls. "You're quiet today," James observed as they arranged place settings in the main dining room. "Just focused," Emily replied, carefully positioning a crystal glass. "Want to make sure everything's perfect. That's the spirit. Though between you and me, I think you could drop a whole tray of dishes and still keep your job, Mrs. Anderson seems to like you." Emily doubted that was true, but she smiled anyway. Around 9:45, she volunteered to polish the silver in the butler's pantry, a task that would put her near the main hallway where she could observe Robert's movements. Sure enough, at exactly 10:03, Robert Anderson walked past carrying his morning coffee and a leather portfolio. Emily counted to 60 after she heard his study door close, then made her move. The study was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway lined with more family portraits. Emily's heart pounded as she climbed the main staircase, every creak of the old wood sounding like a gunshot in her ears. She passed the wedding preparations happening in the various rooms, nodding at other staff members who were too busy to question why she was heading upstairs. The hallway was empty when she reached it, and she could hear Robert's voice behind the heavy oak door of his study, engaged in what sounded like a heated phone conversation about construction permits. Emily tried the handle, knowing it would be locked, but she had to check. The door didn't budge, but Emily hadn't grown up in poverty without learning a few unconventional skills. When you lived in apartments with broken locks and needed to keep your few valuables safe, you learned how to pick simple mechanisms. The study lock was old-fashioned, the kind that looked impressive but wasn't particularly sophisticated. She pulled a bobby pin from her hair and bent it into the right shape. Grateful for the long-ago lessons from her neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been a locksmith before arthritis forced him to retire, the lock clicked open after less than 30 seconds of careful work. Robert's voice was still audible from inside. talking about zoning regulations and city council votes. Emily slipped inside and closed the door silently behind her. The study was everything she'd expected from a wealthy patriarch's private domain. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, a massive mahogany desk positioned to command the room. But Emily wasn't interested in the obvious displays of power. She was looking for anything that might explain her mother's connection to this family. She started with the desk drawers, moving quickly but carefully. The top drawers contained the usual office supplies and business cards. The bottom drawer on the right was locked, which immediately caught her attention. Emily went to work on it with another bobby pin, and within moments it clicked open. Inside, she found a collection of file folders organized with military precision. The labels made her breath catch. Personnel files, domestic staff, background checks, incident reports. Emily pulled out the domestic staff file with trembling hands. The folder contained employment records dating back 30 years. Emily flipped through them until she found what she was looking for. Bennett, Elizabeth, hired June 2004, terminated March 2005. Her mother's employment file was thicker than the others, and as Emily opened it, her world tilted on its axis. The first document was a standard employment application, filled out in her mother's familiar handwriting, but the details were wrong. All wrong. According to the application, Elizabeth Bennett was 19 years old when she was hired, which meant she would have been born in 1985, not 1980 like the memorial plaque said. The address listed was a Southside apartment Emily had never heard of. Under emergency contact, her mother had written, Helen Smith, grandmother. Emily's mind reeled. If Helen was Elizabeth's grandmother, that would make Helen Emily's great-grandmother. Not her grandmother, but why lie about that? The next document made Emily's stomach drop. It was a medical report dated September 2004, confirming that Elizabeth Bennett was pregnant. The file showed that Robert Anderson had been notified immediately. Emily flipped to the next page and found a handwritten note on Anderson family letterhead. EB, situation must be handled discreetly. Family reputation cannot be compromised. Arrange marriage to RA immediately. RWA. RWA had to be Robert Anderson. But who was RA? Emily found her answer in the next document. A marriage certificate dated October 15, 2004, between Elizabeth Bennett and Richard Anderson. Richard Anderson, Robert's younger brother, according to the family photos she'd seen. Emily remembered the conversation she'd overheard the previous day. He was always the gentle one, not like Robert. So her mother had been pregnant and forced into a marriage with Richard Anderson to avoid scandal. But that still didn't explain the timeline. If Elizabeth had been pregnant in September 2004 and Emily was born in May 2005, then Emily did the math quickly. She would have been conceived in August 2004, just 2 months after her mother started working for the Anderson family. And if Elizabeth had been forced to marry Richard to cover up a pregnancy, then who was Emily's real father? The answer hit her like a physical blow when she found the final document in the file. It was a DNA test report dated November 2004, comparing samples from subject EB, fetus, and RW Anderson. The results showed a 99.7% probability of paternity. Emily sank into Robert Anderson's leather chair, the file slipping from her numb fingers. Robert Anderson was her father, the man whose house she'd been cleaning for 3 days, whose silver she'd been polishing, whose family's wedding she was helping to cater. He was her biological father. Her mother had been 19 years old, working as a domestic servant. When her wealthy employer had gotten her pregnant and then forced her to marry his younger brother to hide the scandal, Emily was the product of what could only be described as a workplace assault by a man with all the power over a teenage girl with none. Robert's voice was getting louder on his phone call, and Emily realized she needed to move. She quickly photographed the key documents with her phone, returned the file to its place, and locked the drawer. But as she stood to leave, she noticed something else on Robert's desk that made her blood run cold. It was today's Chicago Tribune, folded to show a small article about a missing person case. But it wasn't the article that caught Emily's attention. It was the handwritten note in the margin. Another one handled, "No loose ends." Emily's hand shook as she photographed the newspaper before slipping out of the study as quietly as she'd entered. Robert's phone call was winding down, and she could hear his chair creaking as he prepared to move. She made it back to the main floor just as Margaret was looking for her. "There you are. I need you to help with the flower arrangements in the east parlor. The bride's mother is having concerns about the color coordination." Emily nodded and followed Margaret, but her mind was reeling from what she'd discovered. She was Robert Anderson's biological daughter, which meant Jacob Anderson was her half-brother. The elaborate wedding she was helping to orchestrate was for her half-brother, and none of them knew who she really was. But the implications went deeper than family connections. The handwritten note about handling someone and leaving no loose ends suggested that Robert Anderson was still actively covering up problems. And if he'd been willing to force a 19-year-old girl into marriage to hide one scandal, what lengths would he go to in order to protect his secrets now? As Emily arranged white roses and tried to appear normal, while the bride's mother fretted about ivory versus cream, she couldn't stop thinking about her mother. Elizabeth had been so young, so vulnerable, working for a family that saw her as disposable. She'd been forced into a marriage to protect their reputation, but what had happened to her after that? The employment file showed her termination in March 2005, which would have been just before Emily was born. Where had Elizabeth gone? How had she ended up with Helen? And why had Helen created an entirely different story about Emily's origins? The questions multiplied with each passing hour, but one thing was becoming crystal clear. The Anderson family had destroyed her mother's life once before. Emily was determined to make sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. But first, she needed to survive the rest of this wedding day without revealing what she'd learned, because if Robert Anderson was capable of the kind of cover-up suggested by that newspaper note, then Emily had just put herself in serious danger by discovering his secrets. The memorial display was still visible from where she worked, her mother's photograph smiling serenely at the wedding guests. Emily wondered if Elizabeth had ever imagined that her daughter would one day return to this house, armed with the truth and ready to seek justice. As guests began arriving for the ceremony, Emily took one last look at the organized chaos of the Anderson wedding and steeled herself for what was to come. She had the beginning of the truth now, but she suspected the worst revelations were still to be uncovered. The wedding ceremony was flawless, at least from Emily's perspective, serving champagne to guests who probably spent more on their shoes than she made in a month. But as she moved through the crowd, offering drinks and canapes, her mind kept returning to the documents she'd photographed in Robert's study. Every time she looked at the happy couple, Jacob in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, Ashley radiant in designer white, she couldn't shake the knowledge that Jacob was her half-brother. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was serving at her own half-brother's wedding, invisible to a family that had destroyed her mother's life. Emily found herself studying Jacob more closely, looking for resemblances she might have missed. They both had dark hair, though his was perfectly styled while hers was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Their builds were similar, tall and lean, but that could be coincidence. "Beautiful ceremony, wasn't it?" an elderly guest commented, as Emily refilled her champagne glass. "Absolutely," Emily replied automatically, though she'd been too distracted to pay much attention to the actual vows. As the reception moved into full swing, Emily noticed Jacob seemed oddly detached for a groom, while Ashley mingled enthusiastically with their guests. Jacob stood slightly apart, his smile polite but distant. When people congratulated him, he thanked them with the same measured responses, as if he were reading from a script during a brief break. Emily found herself in the kitchen when Rosa mentioned something that made her ears perk up. "Strange family, the Andersons," Rosa muttered to one of the other caterers. "I've been working events for 20 years, and I've never seen a groom who looked less happy to be getting married." "Rich people problems," the other woman replied with a shrug. "Maybe it's one of those arranged marriages. You know how these old families operate." But Emily was beginning to suspect Jacob's detachment had nothing to do with the marriage itself. The way he'd spoken to her in the library about family secrets, the careful distance he maintained from his father. It all suggested someone who was playing a role rather than living authentically. Her suspicions were confirmed during the dinner service when she overheard a conversation between Jacob and his best man, a college friend named David, who'd had perhaps one too many drinks. "I still can't believe you're going through with this," David said, his voice slightly slurred. "After everything you discovered about your family, I thought you'd want to run as far away as possible. Sometimes the best way to destroy something is from the inside," Jacob replied quietly, his voice carrying a coldness that made Emily's skin crawl. "Just be careful, man. Your father's not someone you want to cross. My father doesn't know what I know. Jacob's voice dropped even lower. And by the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. Emily nearly dropped the serving tray she was carrying. Jacob wasn't the dutiful son she'd assumed. He was planning something. But what? And how did it connect to the secrets she'd uncovered about her mother? She tried to get closer to hear more, but the conversation had moved on to safer topics. However, Jacob's words echoed in her mind. After everything you discovered about your family, what had Jacob discovered? And when? Later, as Emily helped clear the dinner dishes, she noticed Jacob stepping outside onto one of the terraces. The October evening was cool but clear, and most guests were staying inside where it was warm. Emily saw her opportunity and followed, grabbing a tray of used glasses as an excuse for being outside. Jacob was standing alone at the stone railing, looking out over the lake. In the moonlight, his wedding tuxedo looked almost funeral appropriate, and his expression was far from that of a happy newlywed. "Excuse me," Emily said quietly, approaching with her tray. "I can come back if you'd prefer to be alone." Jacob turned toward her, and for a moment, his careful mask slipped. Emily saw pain in his eyes, deep, raw pain that reminded her of her own feelings when she'd learned the truth about her mother. "No, it's fine," he said. "Actually, I've been wanting to talk to you." Emily's heart skipped. "Me? Why?" Jacob studied her face in the moonlight. "You look familiar. Have we met before today?" "I don't think so. This is my first time working for your family." Jacob continued to stare at her with an intensity that made Emily nervous. "What's your full name?" "Emily Smith." "Smith," Jacob repeated slowly. "And your mother?" Emily's mouth went dry. Why was he asking about her mother? She passed away when I was young. I'm sorry to hear that. What was her name?" Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to lie, to give a false name and walk away. But something in Jacob's expression, a recognition she couldn't quite place, made her tell the truth. Elizabeth Bennet. Jacob's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went completely white, and he gripped the stone railing so hard his knuckles turned pale. "Elizabeth Bennet," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Did you know her?" Jacob was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dark lake. When he finally spoke, his words sent chills down Emily's spine. "She was my stepmother briefly." Emily felt the world tilt around her. "Your stepmother?" "She married my uncle Richard in 2004. I was 17 at the time." Jacob's voice was carefully controlled, but Emily could hear the emotion underneath. "She died when I was 21. That's when I learned the truth about what really happened to her." "What truth?" Emily's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Jacob turned to face her fully, and in his eyes, she saw a pain that matched her own. The truth about what my father did to her, about why she was forced to marry Richard, about how she really died. Emily's legs felt weak. How did she die? The official story was a car accident, but that's not what happened. Jacob's jaw tightened. My father had her killed because she threatened to expose his business dealings. She'd discovered he was using construction contracts to launder money, and when she tried to blackmail him, he eliminated the problem. The words hit Emily like physical blows. Killed, but the memorial says she died in 2010. She didn't die in 2007 like you probably thought, Jacob said. My father kept her prisoner for years, first in the marriage to Richard, then other ways. Emily's vision blurred. Other ways. After Richard died in 2008, Elizabeth tried to leave. She threatened to go to the authorities about the money laundering and about... Jacob paused, seeming to struggle with the words. About what my father had done to her when she worked here. What had he done? Jacob met her eyes directly. He raped her, Emily, multiple times. And when she got pregnant with his child, he forced her to marry Richard to cover it up. Emily's knees buckled, and she had to grab the railing to keep from falling. Pregnant with his child. The baby was born in May 2005, a daughter. Jacob's voice was gentle now, filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass years of pain. My father told everyone the child died with Elizabeth in the car accident, but I don't think that's true. Emily stared at Jacob, her mind reeling. Why don't you think that's true? Because when Richard was dying in 2016, he confessed everything to me. He told me about the forced marriage, about Elizabeth's real fate, about the daughter who was supposed to have died. But he also told me something else. Jacob paused, studying Emily's face. He told me that my father arranged for the child to disappear, not die. He gave her to someone who would raise her far away from the Anderson name. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Emily saw the recognition in Jacob's eyes, the same recognition she was feeling as she looked at him. "Emily," Jacob said quietly, "what's your grandmother's name?" "Helen Smith," Emily whispered. "And she's always told you that your mother died when you were 5. Emily nodded, unable to speak. "When's your birthday?" "May 15th, 2005. Jacob closed his eyes as if in pain when he opened them again. They were filled with tears. "Emily," he said gently, "I think you're my half-sister. I think you're Elizabeth's daughter, the child everyone thought was dead." Emily felt the last pieces of her world crumble around her. Everything Helen had told her, every story about her mother, every detail of her own origin, all lies designed to protect her from a truth too terrible to face. "If that's true," Emily said, her voice breaking, "then what really happened to our mother?" Jacob's expression hardened. "My father had her committed to a private psychiatric facility in 2008. She spent 2 years there, heavily medicated, until she finally died from what the doctors called complications from treatment. But I think she was murdered. Emily, I think my father killed her to keep her quiet, and he's been covering it up ever since." As Emily absorbed this devastating revelation, she realized that Jacob's coldness, his detachment at his own wedding, suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't a happy groom celebrating his future. He was a man planning revenge against the father who had destroyed their mother. "Jacob," Emily said slowly, "what are you planning to do?" Jacob's smile was cold and determined. "I'm going to destroy him, Emily. I'm going to expose every crime he's ever committed and watch his empire crumble. I've been planning this for years. And Ashley, your new wife, Ashley is a Kennedy, her family has connections to judges, prosecutors, federal investigators. Marrying her gives me access to people who can't be bought or intimidated by my father." Jacob's expression softened slightly. "She doesn't know the real reason I pursued her, and I hate using her this way, but it's the only path to justice for our mother." Emily stared at her half-brother. This man who had spent years plotting revenge while she had grown up in ignorance. "You've known about me. You've known I was alive. I suspected, but I wasn't sure until tonight. When I saw you, something clicked. You have her eyes. Emily, you have Elizabeth's eyes." As they stood together on the terrace, Emily realized that everything in her life had been leading to this moment. She wasn't just a struggling waitress who'd stumbled into the wrong family's secrets. She was Elizabeth Bennet's daughter, returned to seek justice for a mother she'd never really known. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Jacob looked back toward the mansion, where their father was entertaining guests at his son's wedding, completely unaware that his 2 children, the ones he'd tried to separate forever, had found each other. "Now," Jacob said, "we finish what our mother started. We make sure Robert Anderson pays for everything he's done." Emily and Jacob stood in stunned silence on the terrace, the weight of their shared revelation hanging between them like a bridge. Neither was sure how to cross. The sounds of the wedding reception drifted through the French doors. Laughter, clinking glasses, the band playing romantic ballads, a surreal soundtrack to the devastating truth they'd just uncovered. "I need to know everything," Emily said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything that happened to her after I was born." Jacob nodded, glancing back toward the mansion to ensure they were still alone. "It's not a story you're going to want to hear. I don't care. I've lived with lies my entire life. I need the truth, no matter how terrible it is." Jacob was quiet for a moment, as if gathering the strength to relive painful memories. "After you were born in May 2005, Elizabeth tried to be a good wife to Richard. He was a decent man. Weak, but decent. He genuinely cared for her, and I think she grew to care for him too. In her own way, for about 3 years, things were relatively stable. Emily wrapped her arms around herself against the cool evening air, but the chill she felt came from more than just the October weather. What changed in 2008? Richard had a heart attack. He was only 42, but the stress of living under my father's thumb, of being part of the cover-up, it wore him down. He survived the heart attack, but it left him weak. That's when Elizabeth started asking questions about their finances, about the family business. Jacob's hands gripped the stone railing as he continued. She discovered that Richard had been signing documents he didn't understand, that my father was using him as a front for illegal construction contracts. When she confronted my father about it, he told her it was none of her business. But Elizabeth wasn't the scared 19-year-old girl she'd been when she first worked here. She was a woman with a child to protect. She threatened to expose him. She did more than threaten. She gathered evidence, photocopied documents, recorded conversations. She was planning to take everything to the FBI. Jacob's voice dropped. But my father found out before she could act. Emily felt sick. What did he do? First, he tried to buy her silence, offered her money, a house in another state, anything she wanted if she'd just disappear and keep quiet. But Elizabeth refused. She said she couldn't live with herself knowing what he was doing, knowing that other people would suffer because of his crimes. So he had her committed. Jacob nodded grimly. In March 2008, Richard had another heart attack. A fatal one this time. The doctors said it was unexpected, but I've always suspected my father had something to do with it. Richard was getting ready to support Elizabeth's decision to go to the authorities. Emily's hands trembled, and after Richard died, that's when my father played his final card. He had Elizabeth declared mentally incompetent, claimed she was having a psychotic break brought on by grief over Richard's death. He had her committed to Riverside Manor, a private psychiatric facility about an hour outside the city. The name hit Emily like a physical blow. She'd seen it on one of the documents she'd photographed, but hearing Jacob say it made it real. For how long? 2 years, Jacob said, his voice barely audible. 2 years of experimental treatments, heavy medication, isolation from the outside world. My father told everyone she was receiving the best possible care for her mental health issues. But the truth was much darker. Emily closed her eyes, trying to process the horror of what her mother had endured. What kind of treatments? The kind designed to destroy someone's memory and credibility. Electroshock therapy. Experimental drugs that were basically chemical lobotomies. By the time I was old enough to ask questions and get real answers, Elizabeth was so heavily medicated she barely recognized her own name. But you visited her? Jacob shook his head. My father forbade any family contact. He said it would interfere with her treatment. It wasn't until Richard's confession in 2016 that I learned where she'd really been all those years. Emily opened her eyes and looked at her half-brother. When did she die? Officially, March 15th, 2010. The death certificate listed complications from psychiatric treatment. But when I investigated later, I found something interesting. Jacob pulled out his phone and showed Emily a photograph of a medical report. This is from an independent autopsy I had performed on her remains in 2017. Emily studied the document. Though the medical terminology was largely incomprehensible to her, what does it say? It says she died from an overdose of lithium and haloperidol, psychiatric medications that, when combined in high doses, can cause cardiac arrest. But here's the important part. The levels in her system were nearly 3 times what would be considered therapeutic. Someone poisoned her. The autopsy suggests that either she was given a massive overdose accidentally, or someone deliberately gave her a lethal combination of drugs. And according to the nursing notes I was able to obtain, Elizabeth had been showing signs of memory recovery in the weeks before her death. She'd started asking about her daughter, wondering where you were. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. She remembered me. The notes indicate she was becoming more lucid, asking staff members about what had happened to her child. She'd started demanding to see legal representation, wanting to know about her rights. Jacob's voice hardened. That's when she suddenly developed complications that led to her death. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way that made Emily feel physically ill. So when she started remembering, when she started asking questions, my father had her killed, just like he's killed anyone else who threatened to expose his secrets. Emily wiped her eyes, anger beginning to override her grief. What about me? How did I end up with Helen? According to Richard's confession, my father arranged that before Elizabeth was committed, he knew that if anything happened to her, questions would be asked about the child, so he contacted Helen, who really was Elizabeth's grandmother, not yours, and made her a deal. What kind of deal? Helen would take you and raise you under a false identity. You'd become Emily Smith instead of Emily Anderson. In exchange, my father would provide enough money for your care and Helen's medical expenses, and he'd ensure that no one ever connected you to the Anderson family. Emily thought about Helen's fear when she'd learned Emily was working at the Anderson house. Her desperate warnings to stay away. Helen knew what he was capable of. Helen knew that if my father ever discovered you were asking questions about your real identity, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the threat. She's been protecting you for 18 years by keeping you ignorant of the truth. But why didn't she just take me and disappear? Why stay in Chicago? Jacob showed her another document on his phone. Because of this, a trust fund my father established in your name, with Helen as the administrator, it's been paying for your housing, Helen's medical care, everything you've needed to survive. But there's a catch. If Helen ever moved you out of state, or if either of you tried to investigate your past, the payments would stop immediately. Emily stared at the trust document, seeing her name listed as the beneficiary of what appeared to be a substantial amount of money. He's been paying for my life all these years. It's cheaper than a murder, Jacob said bitterly, and it ensured Helen's cooperation. She couldn't risk losing the money you needed to survive, so she maintained the lie and hoped you'd never discover the truth. But now I have. Now you have, Jacob agreed. And my father doesn't know it yet. That gives us an advantage. Emily looked back toward the mansion, where Robert Anderson was no doubt playing the role of proud father at his son's wedding. He's been able to live with himself all these years, knowing what he did to her. Men like my father don't see people like Elizabeth as fully human, Jacob said. She was a problem to be solved. Nothing more. The fact that she was young, that she had a child, that she was someone's daughter and granddaughter, none of that mattered to him. And what about all the other victims? You mentioned he's killed other people. Jacob's expression grew even darker. The construction business has been his cover for decades. Whenever someone threatens to expose the corruption, the unsafe building practices, the bribes, they have accidents. Construction sites are dangerous places. It's easy to arrange for someone to fall from scaffolding or get crushed by equipment. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. How many people? I've documented at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 20 years. Workers who tried to form unions, inspectors who couldn't be bought, city officials who started asking too many questions. My father has turned murder into a business expense. And you've been gathering evidence all this time. For 7 years. Ever since Richard's confession, I've been building a case that will expose everything. The murders, the corruption, the cover-ups. But I needed access to federal investigators who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. Jacob gestured toward the mansion. Ashley's uncle is a federal prosecutor. Her cousin is an FBI agent. Marrying into the Kennedy family gives me connections my father can't touch. Emily looked at her half-brother with new understanding. You've sacrificed your entire adult life for this. Our mother deserved better than the death she got. She deserved justice. Not just for herself, but for all the other people my father has destroyed over the years. Jacob met Emily's eyes. But I never expected to find you, Emily. I thought I was alone in this fight. You're not alone anymore, Emily said firmly. I want to help. I want to make him pay for what he did to her, to all of them. It's dangerous. If my father even suspects what we're planning, then we'll have to make sure he doesn't suspect until it's too late. Emily felt a strength she didn't know she possessed flowing through her. Our mother tried to expose him and died for it. But we're not powerless 19-year-old girls. We're his children, and we know all his secrets. Jacob smiled for the first time since their conversation began. You really are Elizabeth's daughter. She had that same determination, that same refusal to back down from a fight, as they walked back toward the mansion. Emily felt the weight of her new identity settling around her like armor. She wasn't just Emily Smith anymore. She was Emily Anderson, daughter of Elizabeth Bennet and Robert Anderson, sister to Jacob, and inheritor of a legacy of both tragedy and justice. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The wedding reception continued in full swing as Emily and Jacob returned to the mansion. But everything felt different now. Emily moved through the crowd of guests with a new awareness. These weren't just wealthy strangers anymore. They were people who had probably known her mother, who might have been complicit in covering up her fate. Every smile felt fake. Every laugh seemed to mock the tragedy that had brought her here. Jacob melted back into his role as the dutiful groom, But Emily caught him watching her throughout the evening. There was a new understanding between them, a shared purpose that needed no words. They were allies now, bound by blood and united by their mother's memory as Emily served dessert and coffee. She found herself studying Ashley Kennedy Anderson with fresh eyes. The bride was radiant, clearly genuinely happy, and seemed completely unaware that her new husband had married her as part of an elaborate revenge plot. Emily felt a stab of sympathy for the young woman who had unwittingly become a pawn in their family's dark game. "You look tired," Ashley said suddenly, appearing beside Emily as she arranged petit fours on a silver tray. "This has been such a long day for everyone." Emily looked up, surprised by the bride's kindness. Ashley's dress was still perfect despite hours of celebration, her makeup flawless, but there was genuine concern in her eyes. "I'm fine, Mrs. Anderson. Just want to make sure everything's perfect for your special day. Oh, please call me Ashley, and you've all done an amazing job. This whole weekend has been like a fairy tale." Ashley's smile faltered slightly. "Though I have to say, Jacob seems a bit distant tonight. Wedding nerves, I suppose." Emily chose her words carefully. "I'm sure it's overwhelming being the center of attention. You're probably right. He's always been somewhat reserved. But lately," Ashley shook her head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be bothering you with this. You have work to do." "It's no bother," Emily said, meaning it. Despite everything, she found herself liking Ashley. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone outside the family. Ashley studied Emily's face for a moment. "You know, you remind me of someone, but I can't place who. Have we met before?" Emily's heart skipped. "I don't think so. I would have remembered meeting you." Well, if you ever need anything, a reference, help finding other work, please don't hesitate to ask. I know what it's like to work for demanding families." Before Emily could respond, Ashley was called away by other guests, leaving Emily to wonder how much the new Mrs. Anderson really knew about the family she'd just married into. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of cleanup and final service. Emily found herself working later than the other temporary staff, partly because she was thorough, but mostly because she wasn't ready to leave. This house held so many secrets, and now that she knew the truth about her connection to it, every room felt significant. It was nearly midnight when Jacob found her in the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishware. "Everyone else has gone home," he said quietly. "We should talk." Emily nodded, drying her hands on a towel. The main house was quiet now. The guests departed. The family retired to their rooms. Even the regular staff had finished their duties and gone home. "There's something I need to show you," Jacob said, leading her through corridors she hadn't seen before. "My father keeps his most sensitive documents in a safe in his private office. Not the study where you found those employment files, but his real office in the basement." They descended a narrow staircase Emily hadn't known existed, emerging into a modern, windowless space that felt more like a bunker than an office. Multiple computer monitors lined one wall, security camera feeds showing various angles of the property. File cabinets filled another wall, and in the corner sat a massive safe that looked like it belonged in a bank. "I've been trying to crack that safe for 2 years, Jacob said, "but I think between the two of us, we might have better luck." Emily studied the safe's digital lock. "Why would I be able to help?" "Because I've tried every combination I could think of related to my father's life. His business, his family, but there's one family member I never considered." Jacob met her eyes. "You, me, think about it, Emily. You represent his biggest secret, his greatest vulnerability. If he were going to use a combination that meant something to him but that no one else could guess." Emily felt a chill of understanding. "My birthday. Try it." Emily approached the safe and entered 51505 on the digital keypad. Nothing happened. She tried 051505, still nothing. "What about the year I was born? 2005. She tried various combinations involving 2005, but none worked. Then she had another thought. What if it's not my birthday? But the day my mother was committed, you said March 2008. She tried 030808, then 030808 on the third variation, 031508. The safe clicked open. Jacob stared at her in amazement. March 15th, the day he destroyed the last threat to his empire. Inside the safe, they found exactly what Jacob had been hoping for. Detailed records of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every cover-up spanning 30 years. But more than that, they found evidence of Robert's personal involvement in multiple murders, including detailed plans and payment records to various enforcers. "My God," Emily whispered, looking through a file labeled Problem Resolution. It contained names, dates, and methods of elimination for over 20 people who had threatened Robert's business interests. "Here," Jacob said, pulling out a thick folder. "Elizabeth Anderson. Final solution." Emily's hands shook as she opened the file. Inside were medical records from Riverside Manor, showing the deliberate overdose that had killed her mother. But there was more. Handwritten notes in Robert's own writing, detailing his decision to eliminate Elizabeth when she began recovering her memories. "Subject becoming too lucid," Emily read aloud from one note. "Asking questions about child's whereabouts, risk of exposure too high, authorize permanent solution." Jacob found another document that made them both freeze. It was a contract with a man named Vincent Torres, dated just 3 days after Elizabeth's death, authorizing payment for services rendered in matter of EA situation. "Vincent Torres," Jacob said grimly. "I know that name. He's done jobs for my father before." Emily looked through more files and found something that made her blood run cold. "Jacob, look at this." She held up a folder labeled HS Monitoring. Helen Smith. Inside were surveillance reports dating back 18 years, documenting Helen's activities, Emily's schooling, their financial situation, even Emily's job applications. "He's been watching us my entire life," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper, "making sure you never got too curious, never posed a threat." Jacob studied the reports. "But look at this recent entry. The most recent surveillance report was dated just 1 week ago. It noted Emily's application for the catering job at the Anderson wedding and included a recommendation that subject should be denied employment to avoid potential complications. He tried to keep you away from here," Jacob realized. But something went wrong with his instructions. Emily remembered Margaret's comments about how the regular catering company had suddenly become unavailable, forcing them to use Mrs. Patterson's service. Maybe he couldn't control every variable. Or maybe, Jacob said thoughtfully, someone wanted you here, before Emily could ask what he meant. They heard footsteps on the stairs above them. Jacob quickly closed the safe while Emily stuffed several key documents into her jacket. "Quick, this way," Jacob whispered, leading her to what appeared to be a utility closet. Inside was a narrow passage that led to a maintenance tunnel. They crouched in the darkness as the footsteps entered the basement office. Through a crack in the door, Emily could see Robert Anderson himself, still in his formal evening wear, checking something on the computer monitors. Robert spent several minutes reviewing security footage from the evening, fast-forwarding through hours of recordings. Emily held her breath when the footage showed her and Jacob on the terrace. But Robert seemed more interested in the main house activities. Finally, he checked the safe, which Jacob had managed to close and relock just in time. Before heading back upstairs, they waited another 10 minutes before emerging from their hiding place. "That was too close," Jacob whispered. "But we got what we needed," Emily said, patting the documents in her jacket. "Between what I photographed from his study and what we just found, we have enough evidence to destroy him. Evidence is only useful if we can get it to the right people," Jacob said. "And my father has connections throughout the Chicago PD and the state attorney's office. We need federal investigators, people he can't touch." "What about Ashley's family connections?" Jacob nodded. "That's our best shot, but we need to be careful about how we approach this, if my father suspects what we're planning." "I know," Emily said. "But Jacob, we can't wait too long. That surveillance file shows he's been monitoring Helen and me for years. If he decides we're becoming a threat, he'll eliminate the problem," Jacob finished. "Just like he did with our mother." As they made their way back through the mansion's corridors, Emily felt the weight of their dangerous game settling on her shoulders. They had the evidence they needed to expose Robert Anderson's crimes, but they were walking a tightrope between justice and survival. "There's something else," Jacob said as they reached the main floor. "Ashley isn't as naive as she appears. I've caught her asking questions about family finances, about some of the property developments that seemed suspicious. I think she's starting to piece things together on her own." Emily considered this. "Do you think we can trust her?" "I think we might not have a choice," Jacob said. "If we're going to move against my father, We'll need all the allies we can get, and Ashley has access to resources we don't. As Emily prepared to leave the Anderson estate, possibly for the last time as an anonymous employee, she realized their small conspiracy was about to become larger. Tomorrow, they would have to begin the delicate process of turning Ashley Kennedy Anderson from an unknowing pawn into a willing ally. Their mother's fight for justice was about to become a family affair. Emily barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while Helen's labored breathing filled the small apartment. The documents she'd stolen from Robert's safe were hidden in a shoebox under her bed, but they felt like they were burning through the floorboards. Every car that passed outside made her tense. Every creak of the old building made her wonder if Robert's surveillance had detected what she and Jacob had done. At 5 a.m., she gave up on sleep and made coffee. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee shop on Clark Street, 8 a.m., come alone, J. Emily knew she should wake Helen, should explain everything that had happened, but she couldn't bring herself to shatter her grandmother's, great-grandmother's, carefully constructed world. Not yet. Instead, she left a note saying she had another catering job and would be home that evening. The coffee shop was busy with the Monday morning rush, which Emily supposed was intentional. Jacob sat in a corner booth, looking like any other businessman with his laptop and morning paper, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room. "You look like hell," he said as she slid into the booth across from him. "Thanks. You look pretty rough yourself for someone who should be enjoying his honeymoon." Jacob's smile was bitter. "Ashley thinks I'm dealing with post-wedding stress. She suggested I take a few days to decompress before we leave for Europe." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Which gives us a small window to act before we disappear for 2 weeks. Emily pulled out her phone and showed him photos of the documents she'd taken. "I spent the night going through everything, Jacob. It's worse than we thought." "How much worse?" "Your father hasn't just been killing people who threaten his business. He's been systematically eliminating anyone who could expose a network of corruption that goes back 40 years. Emily scrolled through the photos. Judges, prosecutors, union leaders, journalists. He has detailed records of 26 murders, including our mother. Jacob's face went pale. 26. And that's just the ones he kept records of. There's also this. Emily showed him a photo of a document labeled Active Threats Assessment dated just 2 weeks ago. He's planning to eliminate 3 more people within the next month. Jacob studied the names on the list. City Councilman Martinez. He's been pushing for investigations into construction contract irregularities. Sarah Chen. She's a federal prosecutor looking into money laundering, and Jacob's blood ran cold. Helen Smith. Emily felt like she'd been punched. Helen's on the list. Subject H. Showing signs of potential cooperation with granddaughter's investigation. Risk level increasing. Recommend permanent solution within 30 days. Jacob read from the document. Emily, he knows you've been asking questions. The surveillance picked up your phone calls with Helen. Emily's hands shook. We have to warn her. We have to get her somewhere safe. If we move too fast, if we change your patterns suddenly, he'll know we're onto him. Jacob grabbed her hands across the table. But you're right, we can't wait. We need to move today. What about Ashley? Have you told her anything? Jacob shook his head. I've been trying to figure out how to approach it last night, after you left. She asked me directly if there was something I wasn't telling her about my family. She said she'd noticed things during the wedding planning. Hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Business associates who seemed more like criminals than contractors. So she's already suspicious. More than suspicious. This morning I found her going through some of my personal files. She said she was looking for our honeymoon itinerary, but I think she was actually investigating. Jacob pulled out his phone. I need to show you something she sent me an hour ago. The message was brief, but pointed. We need to talk about your family's business. Meet me at home after your morning meeting, and Jacob. I know more than you think I do. Emily looked up from the phone. She knows. The question is how much, and whether we can trust her. Jacob's expression was grim. If she's working with my father, if this has all been some elaborate setup, then we're already dead, Emily finished. But if she's genuinely trying to help, then we might actually have a chance. Jacob stood up. I'm going to go talk to her. If she's an ally, we need her resources. If she's not, be careful, Jacob. If your father suspects you know the truth. I know, But we're running out of time. Every hour we wait is another hour for him to move against Helen, against those other people on his list. Jacob paused. There's something else. Last night, I overheard him on a phone call. He's accelerating his timeline for something called Project Clean Slate. Emily felt a chill. What's Project Clean Slate? I don't know yet, but based on the context, it sounds like he's planning to eliminate all potential threats and disappear, maybe leave the country, maybe just retire to somewhere he can't be extradited from. Jacob met her eyes. I think our investigation has spooked him more than we realized. After Jacob left, Emily sat in the coffee shop for another 30 minutes, trying to process everything. She called in sick to her regular job at the diner, claiming food poisoning. Then she took 2 buses and the L train to Helen's doctor's office, using a route she'd never taken before in case she was being followed. Dr. Patterson was a kind woman in her 60s who had been treating Helen for years. Emily had called ahead, claiming a family emergency. I need to ask you about my grandmother's medical history, Emily said once they were alone in the office. Specifically, who's been paying for her treatment. Dr. Patterson looked uncomfortable. Emily, I'm not sure I should discuss financial arrangements. Doctor, I think my grandmother might be in danger. I need to know if someone has been controlling her medical care, maybe using it as leverage. The older woman studied Emily's face for a long moment. Your grandmother receives excellent insurance coverage through something called the Bennett Foundation. It's covered everything. Her medications, treatments, even some experimental therapies that weren't covered by Medicare. The Bennett Foundation. I always assumed it was set up by your mother's family, given the name. Helen never talked about it much, but the coverage has been comprehensive for almost 20 years. Emily felt pieces clicking into place. The Bennett Foundation, using her mother's maiden name to hide Robert Anderson's involvement. Doctor, has anyone else ever made decisions about Helen's care? Anyone besides her? Dr. Patterson hesitated. There have been consultations, a gentleman who identified himself as a family friend, making sure Helen received the best possible care. He's been very generous, funding treatments that have kept her alive far longer than we initially expected. What gentleman? He never gave me his full name, just said to call him Mr. R. He seemed very concerned about Helen's welfare, and about yours too. He asked about your schooling, your health, whether you seemed happy. Emily's blood ran cold. Robert Anderson had been controlling Helen's medical care for decades, using it to ensure her silence and cooperation. He'd kept Helen alive not out of kindness, but because she was useful as long as she maintained the lies about Emily's identity. Doctor, I need you to do something for me. If anyone calls asking about Helen or me, if anyone tries to change her treatment or access her medical records, I need you to contact me immediately. Emily wrote down her number. And if possible, don't let anyone know I was here today. Emily's next stop was the bank where Helen kept their small savings account. She convinced the manager to let her review the deposit history, claiming she was helping Helen organize her finances. What she found confirmed her worst fears. For the past 18 years, regular deposits had been made to Helen's account. Always in cash, always the same amount, always on the same date each month. The amounts had increased over time, keeping pace with inflation and Helen's growing medical expenses. Someone had been ensuring they had just enough to survive, but never enough to be truly independent. As Emily rode the bus home, her phone buzzed with another text from Jacob. Ashley knows everything. She's been investigating the family for months. We're meeting tonight to plan our next move. Can you get Helen somewhere safe? Emily stared at the message, realizing that their small conspiracy was about to become something much larger and much more dangerous. But she also realized they might actually have a chance of succeeding. When she got home, Helen was awake and alert, sitting in her chair by the window. You're home early, Helen observed. Everything all right? Emily sat down across from her great-grandmother, the woman who had sacrificed her own peace of mind to protect her for nearly 2 decades. Helen, we need to talk. About my mother, about the Anderson family, about everything you've been hiding to keep me safe. Helen's face went white. Emily, what have you done? I've learned the truth, and now we're both in danger because of it. Emily reached out and took Helen's frail hands. But I'm not going to let anything happen to you. We're going to finish what my mother started, and we're going to make sure Robert Anderson can never hurt anyone else again. Helen looked into Emily's eyes, and saw the same determination that had once shone in Elizabeth's face. "Then God help us all," Helen whispered. "Because once you start a war with a man like Robert Anderson, there's no going back." Outside, a black sedan drove slowly past their building for the third time that day. The driver made a note on his clipboard and reached for his phone. The endgame was about to begin. The Anderson mansion had been transformed once again, but this time not for celebration. The remnants of the wedding. White flowers now wilting. Golden chairs stacked in storage. Created an almost funeral atmosphere as Emily walked through the front doors for what she knew would be the final time. It had taken 3 days of careful planning to reach this moment. 3 days of Helen reluctantly revealing the full scope of Robert's control over their lives. Of Jacob and Ashley working together to contact federal investigators, and of Emily gathering the courage to walk back into the house where her mother had suffered and died. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Confront Robert Anderson during what he believed was a routine family dinner, in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Ashley had arranged for her uncle, federal prosecutor David Kennedy, to attend under the pretense of a post-wedding family gathering. FBI agent Sarah Chen, one of the people on Robert's hit list, would be positioned outside with a full team. Emily wore the same black server's uniform she'd worn during the wedding. But this time she wasn't invisible. Jacob had convinced his father to hire her for a small family dinner, claiming Ashley wanted to thank the standout staff members from their wedding. Robert had agreed without suspicion. After all, what threat could one poor waitress possibly pose? "Remember," Jacob said quietly as they met in the kitchen, "we need him to confess to something actionable in front of Uncle David. The documents we have are evidence, but first-hand testimony will seal the case." Emily nodded, checking the small recording device hidden in her uniform pocket. "Helen's safe. Ashley's aunt is staying with her at a secure location." Helen finally agreed to testify about the threats and the payments, about everything she's known for 18 years. The dinner party was small. Robert, Jacob, Ashley, and Uncle David, with Emily serving as the only staff member, as she carried in the first course. Emily felt Robert's eyes on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You look familiar," Robert said suddenly, his voice cutting through the polite dinner conversation. "Have we met before?" Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I worked your son's wedding, Mr. Anderson. Perhaps you remember me from then." Robert studied her face for a long moment. "No, it's something else. You remind me of someone I used to know." Ashley smoothly redirected the conversation. "Uncle David, Jacob was telling me about some of the family's construction projects. Weren't you involved in some municipal contract work over the years, Robert?" "Various projects," Robert replied carefully, his eyes still fixed on Emily. "Nothing that would interest a federal prosecutor, I'm sure." David Kennedy smiled. "Actually, I find construction law fascinating. The regulations, the bidding processes. There's so much room for creative interpretation." Emily served the main course while listening to the careful verbal sparring between Robert and the prosecutor. Jacob was slowly steering the conversation toward specific projects that Emily knew from the documents were connected to bribes and murders. "The Riverside Development Project was particularly successful," Jacob said casually. "Though didn't we have some trouble with union organizers back then?" Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Nothing that couldn't be handled through proper channels." "Proper channels," David Kennedy repeated thoughtfully. "I imagine that includes negotiations with union leadership. When necessary." Robert's voice had grown colder. "Some union leaders can be quite unreasonable. They require firm management." Emily was refilling water glasses when Robert suddenly grabbed her wrist. "I know where I've seen you before. You have Elizabeth's eyes." The room went silent. Emily met Robert's gaze directly, no longer hiding behind the mask of servitude. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." Jacob stood up slowly. "Father, I'd like you to meet Emily Anderson, your daughter." Robert's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, recognition, calculation, and finally, cold fury. "That's impossible. The child died with Elizabeth." "No," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "The child survived. Helen Smith, Elizabeth's grandmother, raised me under a false identity, with money you provided to ensure our silence." David Kennedy had gone very still, his prosecutor's instincts recognizing that he was witnessing something significant. Ashley reached for her phone. sending a predetermined signal to the FBI team outside. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," Robert said, releasing Emily's wrist and standing up. "But this conversation is over." "Actually, it's just beginning," Jacob said. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "Emily and I have been going through your files, Father. All of them." Robert looked at the folder, then at his son, and Emily saw the moment when he realized the scope of their betrayal. "You ungrateful little bastard. After everything I've given you, everything I've built for this family, everything you've built on blood," Jacob shot back. 26 murders, Father. We have the records, the payment receipts, the assassination contracts, including the one for our mother. Your mother was a whore who tried to destroy this family," Robert snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "She got what she deserved." David Kennedy was recording the conversation on his phone now, no longer pretending this was a social dinner. "Mr. Anderson, I think you should be aware that anything you say—" "I know exactly who you are, Kennedy," Robert interrupted. "Ashley's uncle, the crusading federal prosecutor. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate my son's new in-laws?" Emily stepped forward, pulling out her own recording device. "Tell him about Riverside Manor, Robert. Tell him how you had my mother committed and tortured for 2 years before having her murdered." Robert's eyes were wild now. "You want the truth? Fine. Your precious mother was blackmailing me, threatening to destroy everything I'd built over one night of indiscretion. She was a nobody, a servant who thought she could bring down a dynasty. So you had her killed," Emily said. "I eliminated a threat to my family's future, just like I've eliminated every other threat over the past 30 years. Robert was ranting now, years of suppressed confessions pouring out. Weak men like the union organizers, corrupt officials who got too greedy, journalists who thought they could expose me. They all learned the same lesson your mother did. Which is, David Kennedy prompted, that some people's lives matter more than others, that maintaining order sometimes requires unpleasant decisions." Robert looked directly at Emily. "Your mother learned that lesson, and now apparently, so will you." Robert reached into his jacket, but Jacob was faster. He tackled his father before the gun could clear its holster, and the two men crashed into the dining table. Crystal shattered, food scattered, and Ashley screamed for the FBI team. The front doors burst open as Agent Chen and her team flooded into the dining room. Robert was on the ground, Jacob holding him down, the gun skittering across the marble floor. "Robert William Anderson," Agent Chen said, cuffing him while reading his rights. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and federal corruption charges." As Robert was hauled to his feet, he looked directly at Emily one last time. "You think this ends anything? You think justice means something? I've been planning for contingencies like this for years, even if you destroy me. There are others who will continue my work." "Maybe," Emily said, standing tall as her father was led away in handcuffs. "But they'll do it without the Anderson name, without the family money, and without the fear that's protected you all these years." Robert's laughter was bitter as the FBI agents led him toward the door. "You have no idea what you've started, little girl. No idea who you're really up against." The mansion felt different after Robert was gone, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the very foundations. Emily stood in the main hall, looking up at the memorial display where her mother's photograph still smiled down at the chaos they'd unleashed. Jacob approached her, his shirt torn from the struggle, but his expression peaceful for the first time since she'd known him. "It's over," he said simply. "No," Emily replied, thinking about Robert's final words, about the network of corruption that extended far beyond one man. "It's just beginning. But at least now we're fighting back." Ashley joined them, her elegant dinner dress stained but her eyes bright with determination. "Uncle David says the evidence you've provided will support federal cases against dozens of Robert's associates. The whole network is going to come down." Emily nodded, but her attention was drawn to the portrait of her mother. For the first time, she thought she could see a resemblance between them, not just in their features, but in their determination to fight against impossible odds. "We did it, Mom," she whispered. "We got him." As if in response, a gust of wind from the open front doors rustled the flowers in the memorial display, and Emily chose to believe it was Elizabeth's way of saying she could finally rest. The war against Robert Anderson was won, but Emily knew the larger battle for justice was just beginning. 3 years later, the community center in Emily's old neighborhood buzzed with activity on a crisp spring morning. Children played in the newly renovated playground while their mothers attended legal aid workshops in the bright, modern classrooms. A banner across the main entrance read, "Elizabeth Bennet Institute for Justice, Protecting Families, Ensuring Truth." Emily stood at the podium in the main conference room, addressing a group of social workers, attorneys, and advocates who had gathered for the Institute's 3rd annual symposium. At 26, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced the worst life could offer and emerged stronger. Her law degree hung on the wall behind her, earned through night classes while working full-time to build the organization that had become her life's mission. "When we started this institute," Emily said, looking out at the diverse crowd, "we had a simple goal: ensure that no woman would suffer in silence the way our founder's mother did. 3 years later, we've provided legal representation to over 500 women, helped secure protective orders against 200 abusive partners, and assisted in the prosecution of 47 cases involving domestic violence and workplace assault." The applause was warm and sustained. In the front row, Helen Smith beamed with pride. At 82, she was frailer than she'd been during their struggle against Robert Anderson, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit indomitable. The medical treatments that had kept her alive, no longer controlled by Robert's blood money, had given her a chance to see her great-granddaughter become the woman Elizabeth would have been proud of. Next to Helen sat Jacob Anderson. Though he'd legally changed his name to Jacob Bennet 2 years earlier, the transformation in Emily's half-brother had been remarkable. The cold, calculating man she'd first met at his wedding had evolved into someone genuinely committed to justice and redemption. His construction company now specialized in affordable housing projects, and he donated the majority of his inheritance to various charitable causes. Ashley Kennedy. Bennet sat beside her husband, their year-old daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Ashley had thrown herself into the Institute's work with the same intensity she'd once applied to social events. Becoming their primary fundraiser and political liaison, her family connections had proven invaluable in securing federal support for their programs. As Emily concluded her presentation, she noticed a familiar figure entering the back of the room, Agent Sarah Chen, now Deputy Director of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, had been instrumental in unraveling the full scope of Robert Anderson's criminal network. Her presence today meant important news. After the symposium ended and the crowd dispersed, Emily joined Sarah, Jacob, Ashley, and Helen in the Institute's private conference room. The walls were lined with photographs documenting their journey, images of court victories, groundbreaking ceremonies, and most prominently, a large portrait of Elizabeth Bennet that had been painted from the memorial photograph Emily had first seen at the Anderson mansion. "I have news about your father," Sarah said without preamble, addressing both Emily and Jacob. "He died in federal prison 3 days ago. Natural causes. Heart attack." Emily felt a complex mix of emotions. Despite everything Robert had done, despite the evil he'd represented, learning of his death brought no satisfaction, only a kind of hollow resolution. "How do you feel about it?" Ashley asked gently. "Free," Emily said after a moment. "For the first time since I learned the truth about my family, I feel completely free." Jacob nodded in agreement. "He can't hurt anyone else now, can't threaten witnesses or try to rebuild his network from prison," Sarah continued. "His death also means we can finally release some information that was held back during the ongoing investigations. The full scope of his crimes was even larger than we initially realized. Our final count shows 34 murders over 4 decades, plus corruption involving over 100 public officials." Helen spoke for the first time, her voice still strong despite her age. 34 families destroyed by one man's greed and cruelty, but also 34 cases that will never see justice in court. Emily added, "That's what troubles me most. All those victims, all those families who will never have their day in court. That's where organizations like this come in," Sarah said, gesturing around the conference room. "You can't bring back the dead, but you can prevent future victims. You can give voice to people who might otherwise suffer in silence." Emily walked to the window overlooking the playground, watching children play on equipment purchased with money reclaimed from Robert's ill-gotten gains. "Sometimes I wonder what my mother would think of all this, whether she'd be proud of what we've accomplished or horrified by what it cost to get here." Helen joined her at the window. Elizabeth was 19 years old when she started gathering evidence against Robert Anderson. She knew the risks, knew she might not survive, but she did it anyway because she believed some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. "You've accomplished something she never could have imagined," Jacob added. "You've turned her tragedy into hope for hundreds of other families." As if summoned by their conversation, Emily's assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Bennett, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." A young woman entered, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair and frightened eyes that reminded Emily painfully of herself. 3 years earlier, she clutched a manila envelope with shaking hands. "Are you Emily Bennett?" the woman asked. "I'm Maria Santos. I work as a housekeeper for the Castellano family. They're in construction like the Andersons used to be." Emily exchanged glances with Jacob and Sarah. The Castellano family had been mentioned in Robert's files as business associates, though they'd never been successfully prosecuted. "What can we help you with, Maria? Mr. Castellano? He's been doing things, bad things, to me and other women who work for him." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been gathering evidence, taking photos, recording conversations, but I'm scared. I don't know who to trust." Emily felt a chill of recognition. Here was another young woman, another housekeeper, facing the same horrors her mother had endured decades earlier. But this time, there was a difference. This time, there was somewhere to turn. "You came to the right place," Emily said firmly. "We're going to help you, and we're going to make sure Mr. Castellano faces justice for what he's done." Sarah was already reaching for her phone. "I'll contact our organized crime unit. If Castellano is following the Anderson playbook, we need to move fast." As Maria broke down in tears of relief, Emily realized that this was what her mother's sacrifice had been for. Not revenge, not even justice for past wrongs, but protection for future victims. The cycle of abuse and silence that had claimed Elizabeth's life was finally being broken. Later that evening, Emily stood alone in the small garden behind the institute. A modest memorial had been built there, not the ostentatious display from the Anderson mansion, but a simple stone bench surrounded by flowers that bloomed year-round. The inscription read, "Elizabeth Bennett, Mother, Truth Teller, Inspiration." Jacob found her there as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the peaceful space. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, settling beside her on the bench. "I was thinking about something Helen told me yesterday. She said that Elizabeth used to read to her from a book of poems, and there was one line she especially loved. 'The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.' Dr. King," Jacob said. "Appropriate quote for our mother." "I think she would have liked knowing that her story didn't end with her death," Emily continued, "that it became the beginning of something larger, something that could help other people. We've built something good here. Something that will outlast all of us." Emily looked at the Institute building, lights still glowing in windows where staff members worked late into the evening, preparing cases and helping clients. Tomorrow, Maria Santos would begin the process of seeking justice against her abuser next week. A dozen other women would attend workshops on their legal rights. Next month, the Institute would open a second location in Milwaukee. "You know what the best part is," Emily said. "Robert Anderson thought he was so powerful, so untouchable. He believed that money and fear could silence any truth, destroy any threat. But in the end, the two children he tried to separate became stronger together than he ever was alone. The Anderson name died with him," Jacob agreed. "But the Bennett name will live on in every life we save, every case we win, every woman who finds the courage to speak truth to power." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Emily felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. The little girl who had grown up believing her mother died in a car accident had become a woman capable of carrying on Elizabeth's fight for justice. The circle was complete, but the story would continue through every person they helped, every life they touched, every victory they won. Elizabeth Bennett's daughter had come home at last, not to the mansion where she was conceived in violence, but to the community where love and justice could flourish together. And in that homecoming, she had found not just her own identity, but her life's true purpose.